Hey everybody, happy Tuesday. I'm Lindsay. I'm here to give you a little bit of information today and sing a song for you. We would love to invite you out to our Wednesday evening children's soccer ministry. That is for children ages 4 and up. That starts at 7 o'clock, and we do have an adult Bible study in the church as well. And then on Saturday, April the 3rd, Easter weekend, we will be having our Easter egg hunt with Pelican Snowballs, and that is from 1:30 to 2:30 at our church. So we would hope to see you there, and I know we'll all have a great time at that. So today I'm going to be playing Do It Again by Elevation Worship, and I hope you all enjoy it. But you have never failed me yet. here's Justin.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. Hope you're doing well. We're less than 2 weeks away from Easter weekend, and we've got some great services planned. Good Friday, that's April 2nd at 7 p.m., and Easter Sunday, April 4th at 7 a.m. and 11 a.m. We have 2 services that day. So we are inviting you, and if you are not planning to attend a church service yet, and you've got friends, family that need to be in church or haven't been in church in a while, fallen out of church, this is a great opportunity to get back in and to see what God is up to and hear a fresh take on what Easter is all about, how the cross changes everything, and then the second part of that story changes everything again. Easter weekend is so monumental, not just for Christians, but for all of creation, whether we realize it or not. Those 2 days in history, real events that took place around a real person, Jesus Christ. His death and his resurrection changes everything, and you don't want to miss our Friday service, which is all about the cross, and our Sunday services, which is all about the resurrection and how creation was restored and healed and cured through that significant event. So we would love to see you there. Be sure to invest and invite over the next couple of weeks, and I think you'll be glad to come and see what God can do in our lives based on what he has done in history. We've been building up to Easter with messages that are centered around God's glory because we believe God's glory is his motivation for everything, that God created the world for his glory. God created the nations and the diversity of the world for his glory. And even though our world is fallen, God is still sovereign over it, and God leverages and uses the events of the world, uses people like us to tell a story of his glory. And this Sunday, we came to a subject and came to a text that especially needs God's light and God's perspective on, because the world takes us in a lot of wrong directions regarding the subject. We opened up to the book of Job. Job, of course, is in the middle of the Bible, but it's one of the earliest stories in the Bible. Job would have lived around the time or even before the time of Abraham. So as Job is going through what we consider a tragedy, Job doesn't have the Bible. He doesn't have the religious community that his descendants would have. He doesn't know what we know about God. He doesn't have all the answers that we think we have about God. So as Job begins to face these trials and Job begins to face these hardships, again, Job doesn't know what the reader knows and all the background information that's going on. All Job knows is that one day he's very rich and one day he's very poor. One day he's just as healthy as can be, and one day he is sick and afflicted and suffering a great deal. One day he has a great family, and the next day he is alone. The story of Job is really about how the world understands suffering and how God understands suffering, and how we as believers can understand suffering. The story of Job, we think it's a tragedy. We think, oh no, if he just knew what we knew. But really it turns out that if we only knew what Job knew and believed what Job believed, we would be better off. The story of Job is about a man who believed in a good God and believed in a sovereign God, and yet knew that he lived in a world that was less than perfect. He knew that he lived in a world that was sinful, in a world that was fragile. And even though we read the story of Job, how he was rich and how he was prosperous and how he was greatly blessed, Job did not find himself in those things. When Job lost those things, he worships God because he still had God. And while we think suffering takes something away from us, Job looked at the trial that he was facing and realized that God had a purpose for it. That God wasn't out of control or off of the throne because of the sufferings that he faced, because Job knew this. Job knew that God was good before he had things good. Job knew that God was sovereign before his life was all lined up and perfect and under control. Job knew that God's goodness and sovereignty was not contingent to his security or his prosperity. So when Job lost those things that we often take comfort in and we often find refuge in and find security in and think that God is, confirmed to be good by, when Job lost those things, Job didn't lose his faith. Because Job still believed that God was just as good and just as sovereign as he was before Job ever existed. And even when Job was blessed, Job still considered himself blessed, even though he was poor, even though he was suffering. So we see this story and we hear this story and we think, wow, how could you be like Job? And how is there any positive spin to put on Job? But what we learn from Job's story is that as Job lost his possessions, Job didn't lose his purpose. Job believed that God still had a plan, and that Job believed what we have learned from Genesis about creation and about the nations that God made, that Job believed that God did everything and that God leveraged everything for his glory, and that if God so saw fit to lead him down this pathway of suffering, then God must have a plan. And what was crucial to Job's story is that Job had patient faith. We often talk about having patience, but it's not just about having patience in and of itself. It's about having patience that's directed somewhere or directed towards someone. And that's about faith. Job had patient faith that all he had to do was trust in God and endure this trial. You see, Job had enjoyed God's prosperity that he gave him, and Job knew that he could endure God's decision to give him pain. Job wasn't angry. God wasn't mad at God. And even though the world lined up and tried to tell Job why he should get mad at God, why he should, feel like that something's, unjust about God, Job refused to do that because Job knew, as he says at the end of the story, I know that my Redeemer lives, and I know that God's plans can't be thwarted. So I am going to hold out to faith. I am going to worship, and I'm going to witness the goodness of God even in the midst of my suffering. Not in spite of my suffering, but because of my suffering. And here's what we learn from Job's story. And here's what we can learn about suffering that is something we push back on, something that we don't want to believe because our flesh and the enemy tells us that unless we have it good, God isn't good. But here's the truth, that suffering can actually be understood as necessary to see and savor the fullness of God. And that the suffering that we face isn't a time when God has lost control or when God has lost a battle to the enemy or when we've, fell under an attack by the enemy. That actually suffering is just God being sovereign and God trying to tell a story that unless we believe that there's more to it, we might give up and we might lose faith. But we can't lose faith in the end of our story. We can't lose faith that God is still up to something. And here's the thing that I think we concluded on and that we should come to find some comfort from. Where does suffering come from? Suffering comes from a world that God created that was twisted and manipulated for and by evil. That suffering roots from things, people that God made, yet that were manipulated and twisted for and by evil. So what we know about God is that God created nature, but he didn't create natural disasters. God created us, but he didn't cause us or intend that we would be less than good. He gave us words to use and actions to take, but he didn't intend that we would use those words for evil and take actions that would cause pain. God made the cells in our body, but he didn't create the cancer that those cells can often mutate or turn into. So the point is this, that the world that God made turned from him, just like we as people turned from him. But what is God's motivation toward us? What is God's action toward us? To redeem us. That God doesn't remove us, he uses us. God doesn't remove us, he redeems us. And in the same way, the sovereignty of God leads him not to remove all suffering, but to use suffering. You say, well, God could have prevented all suffering. Well, if God would have prevented all suffering, he would have had to prevent the people that caused the suffering, which includes me and includes you. So rather than preventing, rather than removing, God uses and God redeems. And that's the story that leads to the cross. Because what does Jesus do on the cross? Rather than removing the sin of the world, he takes it on himself. Rather than removing those that caused him to suffer and die, he refused to remove them because he refused to remove us. And rather, he removed the sin off of us and took it on himself. He was determined to save us, so he suffered for us as all of us. And in that moment, in the cross, Jesus takes suffering and redeems it. Jesus takes suffering and redefines it. Peter says that we can share in the glory of Christ when we suffer. Suffering apart from Christ may seem like it doesn't have a purpose, but remember, Job knew that there was purpose. And Job said, I know my Redeemer lives. He's going to redeem this moment. And what does Jesus do on the cross? In the lowest point of creation, Jesus bears all of the evil and all the sin, and he redefines it and he redeems it for something great. He redeems it for our salvation. So in the moments that we face that are trials, that are frustrating, that are difficult, that are painful, as James tells us, that we should endure and know that there's something that God is doing, that there's joy, and that there's a full work, there's a finished work that God is trying to get us towards. That Jesus on the cross said it is finished, right? That's the fullness of God's plan. That's how God is glorified. So God is glorified in our trials. We can glorify God in our trials by getting to the end of them, enduring to the end and seeing that God had a plan. James says, remember the steadfastness of Job. He didn't give up on the purpose of God because he had patient faith. So I think our prayer needs to be, God, use this until you choose to remove this. Give us patient faith to trust in your plan in spite of our pain. You know, we can experience God's purpose through our pain. We can experience God's plan and trust in God's plan no matter what trial we face if we persevere with a patient faith. So what is God's purpose for your trial? What is God's purpose for your suffering? That you would have a patient faith and glorify him and get to the end of it so that you might see what God was up to all along. Rather than removing it, rather than preventing it, God chooses to use it. He chooses to redeem it, just like he chooses to redeem me and chooses to redeem you, just like he chooses to redeem the world rather than remove the world. So I hope this helps add some perspective to the suffering and the trials and the tribulations that we are bound to face. And unlike the world's perspective, unlike our tendency to see Job and his story as a tragedy, Job's story is a story of a God who leverages the bad for something glorious, leverages pain for purpose, just like he can do for you, just like he can do for anybody. You know, if this video has encouraged you today, if it's helped you today understand the trials that we face in light of what we've been through this past year, in light of what we may be facing even ahead of us, if this video has encouraged you, would you consider liking our page, sharing our content with those that you know that might need this same encouragement? And if you would be with us on Wednesday night, we'll continue to study God's Word together. We have some great services planned for the future. So stay tuned to our channel, stay tuned to our page. We hope that these videos continue to encourage you, and we hope that you'll come and see what God is doing at Rîsen Church. God bless you, and take care.